Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know we are right at 2 o'clock and people are rolling on in, so I'm going to go ahead and give a quick overview of what we're going to be doing today. So we have a wonderful presentation entitled How to Support Your Educators with SEL in Times of Uncertainty. We have Jennifer Robitaille and Megan Dunham on today who are going to give you some great information. My name is Emily, and I'm going to walk you through the Zoom system before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive a replay at the end of the presentation to share with your teams. If you're having trouble seeing the screen, you should first exit the full screen view. If you still can't see the slides, you can double click on the small box at the top middle of your screen, and it should bring up the slide deck. You should also see 3 functions at the bottom of your screen. The first is the chat feature, which can be used to ask or share any questions or share any tech issues. Why don't we try it out and have everybody put in their name, district or organization, and job title. If you're on a mobile device, the chat feature will be under the ellipses on the bottom right-hand corner. Another feature we have is the Q&A button. This is where you can pose any questions for our presenters today, and we'll either answer them as we go or we will hold them to the end of the presentation. Finally, there's the raise the hand function. This function can be used if you have any tech issues, and we will respond to you one-on-one in the chat. And we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so be sure to submit those questions in the Q&A box for us. And it's really short and sweet today. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jen to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. Welcome, everyone. We are really excited to join you all today to talk about supporting your staff with social and emotional learning, particularly in these times of uncertainty. We have 3 objectives for our short time together today. So first, we'll be describing why supporting educator social emotional competence is so important. This is a topic that, as you all know, has always been important, but for many reasons, today we're really going to just be focusing on the current context of educators preparing to go back to school. Then second, we will be talking about and introducing you to a new professional development program and collection of resources called EdSERT. EdSERT has been designed in response to these many reasons why supporting Educator SEL is so important that we will talk about. And it's particularly been created to help support educators, and that's K-12 educators working in both school settings and out-of-school time programs, to support their knowledge about social and emotional learning, to support their social and emotional teaching practices, as well as to support their own well-being. And then third, all throughout the webinar today, and then also after the webinar, we'll be sharing some strategies with you all that will help you support your staff as part of their return to school. And ultimately, these are things that will also support your students. So with that, I want to start by beginning briefly and providing some context for our discussion today. I want to briefly just provide an overview of social and emotional learning, just to make sure we're sort of all talking about the same thing today. So SEL is defined as the process through which both children and adults effectively acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to do things like understand and manage their emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. Collectively, these 5 skills, which you can see displayed in the inner circle of this graphic, have been found to be critical for successful outcomes, both in school and in life. And there's a large body of research that really demonstrates how important these skills are for students. Very briefly, as an example, research has shown that these skills impact students' attitudes about themselves, about school, and about others. They impact their academic performance and achievement, their behaviors both inside and outside of the classroom, as well as their emotional well-being. And over time, these skills can help students be more likely to graduate from high school, persist in college, and ultimately, for all of us, perform better in the workplace. And although these social and emotional skills are really important all the time, today we're really focusing on the back to school and all the uncertainty that folks are facing in the return to school. And so as students prepare to return, they're really going to need to be able to draw upon these social and emotional skills as they're returning to school in potentially a very different school learning environment. And this is really true regardless of whether students will be returning to school in person or virtually, or for many students, experiencing both of these learning environments each week. So let's just think for a moment about a student who will be starting the school year remotely, either fully online or as part of a hybrid model where the student's at home 2 or 3 days a week. Think for a moment about the various social and emotional skills that student's going to need to draw upon. So for example, they're going to need to draw upon their self-management skills to stay focused at home when they're participating online. They'll also need to rely on their personal responsibility skills to properly manage their time, on their schoolwork and getting their work done with probably fewer reminders or prompts than they would have experienced in the classroom. And these are really just two very brief examples. Now let's think about a student who will be physically in school at least a few days per week. Many schools are planning to do things like reduce class sizes, space desks farther apart, require students to stay at least 6 feet apart in common areas such as hallways, and to not touch each other or get too close to one another, among other expectations. The success of these various strategies is ultimately going to depend on students being able to demonstrate social and emotional skills such as responsible decision making and self-management in order to follow and comply with these guidelines. They'll also need to display things like social awareness skills in order to respond to their peers with empathy and compassion when, for example, their classmates might be overexcited to see them and want to hug them, to greet them, or other students might be feeling overly anxious about being back in person, and may require students to really be compassionate to them for those reasons. And these are just a few examples. Other key social and emotional skills that will be called upon when students return to school include things like being able to manage your emotions, to effectively problem solve challenges or changes or challenges that occur, and also to maintain a sense of optimism and hopefulness as we all adjust to this new normal. And as a response to this increased emphasis that's being placed on needed student social and emotional skills, many school districts and organizations are asking their teachers to teach social and emotional learning to students, and also to just do more in general to support the social and emotional needs of students. But as we know, most educators actually have not received any kind of pre-service training around social and emotional learning. Few colleges or few universities actually provide explicit coursework on SEL. They might cover things like child or adolescent development, but there's very few programs, teacher preparation programs, that actually explicitly focus on SEL. And then depending on the teacher's specific student teaching experiences, they may or they may not have had the opportunity to actually deliver SEL in the classroom. There's also at the moment no praxis exams for SEL like there are for content subjects like math or science, and there's limited opportunities to get a certification in SEL currently. In addition to this, we also know through several national surveys of educators that although by and large they see and value SEL as being really critically important, They also specifically ask for more resources, more training, and more guidance on how they can effectively use SEL in their own classrooms and with their students. So this means that as your staff are preparing for back to school or already back in school, they might be thinking things like, what am I supposed to do about SEL this year? Or how can I best support the social and emotional needs of my students? And these questions might really be coming up, especially if they're trying to adapt their curriculum and their coursework to a new learning environment. For example, if they're now teaching virtually, whereas they've never done that in the past. They're also thinking about, how can I interact and engage with my students in ways that, are now different for me? How do I make those changes? And, in addition to this sort of lack of training and resources available that staff are telling us, at the same time, we also need to think about all of the stress that's brought on in response to COVID-19. So all of us, regardless of our profession, are experiencing some type of increased stress and anxiety at this point, which is brought on by our fears related to our health or our family's health, balancing work and life, amongst other things. At the end of March, right as many schools were closing down for the COVID-19 crisis, researchers at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence launched a survey to check in on how teachers were doing, and teachers really across the United States. In just 3 days, they received over 5,000 responses from teachers, and as part of this survey, teachers reported on the 3 most frequent emotions that they were feeling each day. And remember, this was in March of this past year. The 5 most mentioned feelings were anxious, fearful, worried, overwhelmed, and sad. And when asked to provide reasons behind these various emotions, the researchers classified these into 2 categories. The first category was really personal to the teachers who responded. So it related to things like a general fear for themselves or for their family about contracting COVID-19. And then the second category focused more on the stress that they experienced as they managed both their own and their family's needs, while at the same time still working and trying to adapt to new online technologies for teaching. Now, I'd imagine now, we're 5 to 6 months later from this, that most educators probably are continuing to experience these same emotions, and probably many others as they are preparing or maybe already back in school. For example, many teachers are trying to figure out how they can teach and reach students in a variety of learning formats or learning environments. And I'd imagine educators who are preparing to switch to a virtual environment are also thinking and worrying about things like how they'll form relationships to their students, how they'll check in and know how their students are doing, how they'll make sure their students are engaged and actively involved in their learning, amongst many other things. But the other thing that's important to note is that these stressors are not solely due to the current crisis. As we know, pre-COVID-19, educators were already telling us that they were experiencing very high rates of stress and burnout. So for example, in a 2017 survey of teachers, they found that nationally 61% of teachers reported that their work was either always or often stressful. And that was being reported at a rate that was twice as high as the general population. We know also that when you have this stress and this anxiety, it impacts physical health and well-being, which that in turn leads to more frequent absences from work and ultimately turnover in the profession. We all know that this profession is characterized by very high rates of turnover. And in addition to the physical and mental toll this has on the educators themselves, there's also a lot of consequences for both our students as well as our districts more broadly. Research has shown that student academic achievement is negatively impacted by both teacher absenteeism and turnover, And school districts face large financial costs, which stem from this turnover. And these are costs related to recruiting, hiring, and onboarding new staff. But, I don't want to just paint a picture that's full of, doom and gloom. Despite all these stressors faced, we do all know that educators by nature are really, really good at adapting to challenges and changes that they face. And I'd love to invite Megan into this conversation. She has experience in the classroom, and I'd love for her to share some examples from her days in the classroom of challenges that maybe she or her colleagues faced and how they went about adapting to those changes. So Megan?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think we all know that teachers and anyone who's an educator is very good at being flexible and adaptable because our students' needs are changing so rapidly. One of the best examples that I can remember from my very first year of teaching was, as we all know, during the winter, sometimes the weather can be a little iffy. And I remember that one day we actually ended up being at school, and then about 2 hours after we arrived at school, we found out that we were going to be leaving at noon. And as you can imagine, that really quick change really was a little disruptive for us. We had some children who were in lunch. We had some children who were in the middle of a lesson, whatever that may be. We had children all over the school in different areas, working in small groups. And immediately, those of us who were ready and willing just kind of got up and started making sure that everyone knew what the protocol was and where we were all supposed to be. And it was very efficient. And I remember thinking to myself how proud I was of our team for pivoting so quickly and being so responsive. And I'm sure that you can imagine a scenario in your own classroom or with your own students where you experienced something where you weren't really expecting what was going to be thrown at you, whether it was good, bad, or in between, and you just responded. Because as a teacher, I think that our number one goal is always what is best for the student. And I think that's why, as educators, we're so responsive and so flexible, because we understand that it's not about us, it's about the kids. I also remember a really funny story actually about a student of mine who actually got sick in my classroom, and as you know, that can be really disruptive and a little anxiety-inducing, especially for some students. And I remember taking my students into the cafeteria to bring them away from the situation, and that my assistant principal said to me how much he appreciated that I just flew into action and not only took care of the student who was sick, but also the rest of the students that were in my classroom. So I want you to take a minute to really think about an instance when you yourself responded in a way that perhaps you didn't give yourself credit for, because I think as educators, we often are so responsive that we don't take a moment to really applaud ourselves for all of the decisions that we have to make so quickly throughout the day. I'll send it back to you, Jen.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan, for bringing in your perspective as a former classroom teacher and giving us some really good real life examples for, how well educators and how quick educators are often required to act and how good at that they are. One of the things, though, that I think I want to drive home as part of this webinar, and one of the key messages I have, is that although we know educators are really good at this and really good at adapting and making things work, I still do believe that we should do what we can to really support them in these things, in these stressors and these challenges they face, and ensure that they have the resources they need to not just get by, but really also thrive in their work. And so the last piece here that I want to mention and highlight here, related to sort of this general overview of the need for Educator SEL, is that we're increasingly seeing research that supports this need for to support educators. Specifically, recent research has shown that when educators' well-being and when their social and emotional competence is supported, they're better able to teach and promote the social and emotional needs of their students. So, for example, we know that they're better able to model social and emotional skills for students in the moment when they themselves have strong social and emotional skills. So, for example, we all know that moment when we need to, something goes wrong and we need to calm ourselves down. Being able to model those steps for calming down in the moment for your students is powerful for their learning. Similarly, modeling how to make an effective decision is also a really great way for students to learn those skills themselves. Educators with strong social and emotional skills have also been shown to be better able to integrate and reinforce social and emotional skills into everyday situations, which is also really important for helping their students learn and acquire these same skills. And then lastly, teachers with strong social and emotional skills are just themselves better role models for those desirable social and emotional behaviors that we're teaching to students as part of SEL. And all of these things are really key for students to be able to use and apply social and emotional skills in their lives. And that's both inside the classroom as well as outside the classroom. And for all of these reasons that we just quickly talked through, there's a growing consensus in the SEL field calling for schools and programs to support educators' professional growth related to social and emotional learning. And that includes both their SEL knowledge and their practice, as well as their own social and emotional competence and well-being. Some examples of this, CASEL recently, within I believe the last year or so, published their guide to school-wide social and emotional learning, which is a really, really great resource that describes some of the key things, or all of the key things that really need to be done as part of school-wide SEL efforts. And they specifically highlight the need as part of this model to strengthen adult SEL and to support all staff in both cultivating their own social and emotional competence and supporting them as they promote the SEL of their students. In addition, the Aspen Institute, in their consensus report that was called From a Nation at Risk to a Nation at Hope, also highlighted the same notion and stated as part of their report that supporting teachers so that they can support students is essential. And in their accompanying practice agenda, they laid out 5 recommendations for the field. And one of those 5 recommendations related to building adult capacity to provide opportunities for school faculty and staff, families, after school and youth development professionals, and future professionals to learn to model and teach social, emotional, and cognitive skills to young people. And if you're working in an after-school or an out-of-school time program, the National After-School Association with the American Institutes for Research also developed a great resource called SEL to the Core. And in this resource, they provide guidance to support after-school professionals and leaders in social and emotional learning. If you look at the image on my screen, you can see at the base of this triangle, they specifically highlight the need to get in touch with your own social and emotional competencies as the educators or the youth development professionals working with these students, really underlying how basic and foundational your own social and emotional competence is to how you then in turn work and support with your students. So that was a pretty quick overview of many of the reasons why supporting educators and staff right now, but really all the time, supporting their own well-being and their own social and emotional learning is critically important. I could talk much longer, but in the essence of time, we'll keep it to that brief review. And that really brings us to our second main objective for this presentation, which is to introduce to you a new program that our team at Aperture has spent the last few years creating called EdSERT. EdSERT stands for the Educator Social Emotional Reflection and Training Program, and it's designed for educators, both school teachers and out-of-school time staff, working with students K-12, and it's really focused on professional development of these educators. And it's got three main goals. The first being to support their knowledge around SEL, because as I mentioned, most teachers have never received explicit instruction or even foundational knowledge on SEL. So it's designed to help support their knowledge. It's also designed to help support their social and emotional skill set, both for themselves as well as in relation to teaching practices for their students. And then lastly, just generally designed to help support the well-being of educators. So the EdSERT program focuses on 8 key social and emotional competencies. And at the start of this presentation, I shared with you the Castle Framework graphic, which includes those 5 key competencies which are so critical for success in school, work, and life. And the competencies that you see here that we promote in the EdSERT program are derived from that Castle framework. Some of the competencies are identical, so both social awareness and relationship skills are the same. But you'll also see that we've modified slightly the Castle framework from 5 competencies to 8. And the areas we changed, as an example, if you look over here, Castle talks about responsible decision-making as one of their 5 skills. We've chosen just to separate out those 2 constructs and focus both on decision-making and personal responsibility as distinct skills. The other area we changed relates to self-management. We've pulled apart the construct of self-management and talked both about self-management in terms of managing your emotions and behaviors, as well as pulled out from there goal-directed behavior, which relates to setting and achieving goals. And then the last area that we changed is we've really highlighted and pulled out as a separate, distinct construct, optimistic thinking. Much of our work has been informed by the resilience literature and resilience theory. And in resilience theory, the notion of being optimistic and having hope and positive thinking is a key protective factor in how we face all of the changes and the challenges and stressors we all face throughout our lives. And so we've chosen to pull optimistic thinking out as its own distinct construct to focus on. If your school or program already uses the DESA comprehensive SEL system, these competencies will look familiar to you. They're the same 8 competencies that are assessed and promoted by the DESA, which focuses on students, K-12. We've specifically chosen to align EdSERT to the DESA so that schools and programs can have a consistent approach and also a consistent language for promoting the social and emotional skills and competencies of their entire organization or entire community, including both their students and their staff. So a little bit about the EdSERT program. The approach to EdSERT, broadly speaking, is one that we've developed to be self-paced and self-directed by the educators themselves. And as part of that, emphasizing educator choice in how they interact and use these resources. So as part of the development of EdSERT, we spent a lot of time throughout the entire development process actually talking to educators themselves. And one of the messages that we heard loud and clear from them is that flexibility in choice is something that they really highly valued in their professional development experiences. So we've tried to really pull that in compiling these resources together for EdSERT. And I'll talk a little bit as I go through this, sort of how that emerges in this program. So EdSERT is organized into 8 separate modules, and it's organized around those 8 social and emotional competencies. So there's 1 module per competency promoted. And as part of each module, educators will receive or experience these 4 components. So the first is professional development. And this includes a series of trainings that will introduce them to each of the 8 social and emotional competencies, talk about why those competencies are important, describe how they show up in students, so what it looks like if a student has that competency or maybe they don't have that competency yet, and also talk about why that competency is important for them and how it's relevant to their role as an educator. The second component then is a self-reflective assessment tool. And again, there are 8 of these, and they're designed to help educators first get to know and identify key teaching practices that are related to each of these 8 social and emotional competencies, and then also give them the opportunity to self-reflect and think about which of these competencies they're already doing, or maybe which of these practices they're already doing, or maybe which of these practices they're not yet doing and they'd like to learn more about. From the assessment then, there's a planning tool called the Personal Development Plan, which guides educators through reflecting about their existing strengths and also helping them to choose 1 or 2 areas that they'd like to focus on building those specific practices. And then lastly, there's strategies available to help them do that and to help them learn more and enhance their use of these key social and emotional competencies within the context of their teaching. So they're all presented as actual teaching practices. So again, this process in general is meant to be self-directed in the sense that educators are spending time thinking about reflecting on their own current use of social and emotional learning, and also choosing areas where they'd like to focus on and competencies they'd like to build for themselves in their classroom based on their own needs or even the needs of their specific students. And then ultimately help them learn new teaching practices that they can use to help them integrate and promote social and emotional learning with their students as part of their daily and typical interactions that they have with students. In terms of the program materials and how EdSERT's organized, the core resource for each of the modules is a printed educator guide. There are 8 of these, 8 guides, 1 for each social and emotional competency covered in the program. And these are all printed booklets, essentially. And then the remaining resources are posted in a password-protected online portal, which we call EdSERT Extras. That's where both administrators or educators themselves can access professional development, as well as supplemental resources related to the strategies themselves, or the program more broadly. So these are the covers of the 8 guides, and this is essentially what they look like. They're each booklets, so a given teacher would receive all 8 of these guides. After the webinar, we'll actually be sharing with you all a special digital edition of the Optimistic Thinking Guide, the last one there in green. The Optimistic Thinking Guide highlights and really focuses on teaching practices that are related to things like optimism, hopefulness, gratitude, and finding meaning and purpose in your work. And so you'll receive that guide, and it'll actually provide all of those 4 components: the PD, the self-reflective assessments, the strategies, and the personal development plan. You'll receive a copy of all of those to check out. This is an example of the self-reflective assessment that you'll see for optimistic thinking. I just want to share it with you just to sort of give you a sense of how this works. The purpose of the reflection is meant to help the educator learn about key social and emotional teaching practices related to the competency, in this case, optimistic thinking, and then to identify which of these practices or one practice that they'd really like to work on, learn more about, and then enhance within themselves. We wrote these items based on both reviewing the literature, the research literature in social and emotional learning and education, and also by talking to educators, experienced educators, as well as administrators who have lots of experience in social and emotional learning and could really help us think through what these important teaching practices look like. So to give you an example of some of these, the very first item on this tool reads, I can list specific ways in which my work as an educator adds pleasure and meaning to my life. A second practice says, I end the day or class period in an optimistic way, reflecting with students about what went well, what was learned, or things to look forward to next time. And I hope you can see from just these two examples that you'll find some of the practices are really focused on the educators themselves. So for example, the very first one, and then other practices are focused more on social and emotional teaching practices that educators would use with students. And I think an important point about this tool is that it's really meant to be private. It's entirely meant for the educator to reflect themselves and think about their own personal growth and development and learning. So we would not recommend that an educator have to share this information with anyone. It's really meant for themselves, unless they choose to share it. So ideally, what would happen is that an educator would complete this tool, think about their current practices, and then pick one or two of these practices that they'd really like to focus on and learn more about. And then they would be directed to strategies that would help them do that. So let's take a look quickly at one of the strategies that's tied to the second item here on the screen, which relates to ending the day in an optimistic manner. So I pulled this part of a strategy here to put on the screen. You'll actually get the whole strategy in that optimistic thinking guide. But just to give sort of a quick glimpse of one of the strategies, the idea here on this strategy is referred to as an optimistic closure, is to develop a routine of reflection and positive thinking that helps to enhance gratitude, appreciation, and optimism about your experiences. So essentially, it's pretty quick, but the strategy involves setting aside a few minutes at the end of the day, maybe your work day or in the evening, and just to do a quiet reflection and think about something positive. Maybe something that happened that went really well that day, or something that you're grateful for. As part of the strategy, we provide some suggested prompts that you could choose to use, or you could come up with your own or implement it in another way. We provide options. And importantly, we also tie this to something that's also beneficial, not just for yourself, but for your students. You can use the optimistic closure strategy, and we provide ways and ideas for doing so with your students to kind of close out the day or maybe close out a class period by spending a minute or two asking students to think about something they're grateful for or something that went positive. And really ultimately, and we hope that, as a result of using strategies like this one, that it'll help promote social and emotional learning as not just another thing or another lesson that educators have to do every single day, but really just be embedded into how they interact and work with their students each and every day. So some other example strategies that you'll find within the EdSERT program are some really simple things that can have a really big impact on students. So there's strategies related to positively greeting students as they arrive maybe into our classrooms or into our virtual classroom, how to effectively model and reinforce the use of social and emotional skills with students in the moment. So there's one about calming down, one about setting SMART goals, another about modeling an effective decision-making process. So those are just sort of some samples or some of the many strategies that are included in these resources. In terms of how EdSERT, we recommend EdSERT be implemented, we really recommend that a school or an organization take a very organized whole school approach to working with these resources. Because there are 8 competencies, it actually works really well to do 1 competency per month throughout the school year, and you can hit all 8 by doing that. So we recommend that sort of everybody is working on the same competency at the same time. But again, they're working with the resources in a very self-directed manner, but everybody at one time is focusing on optimistic thinking, or everybody in 1 month is focusing on relationship skills. We also recommend providing some kind of dedicated time for educators to engage with the resources in the program. We estimate it takes about an hour per month to go through the resources, and that includes the professional development, taking the self-assessment, going through your planning. The strategies themselves are meant to be implemented throughout the school day, so that doesn't need additional time. And for the programs, the schools that we work with now who are using EdSERT, we find that what works really well is to incorporate this as part of grade or department level meetings. Others are using it as part of professional learning communities, and others have used it as general PD or as part of your staff meetings. Ultimately, the notion behind this recommended implementation approach is to communicate to your staff a commitment to their own well-being, to their own professional development around social and emotional learning, and ultimately showing that connection between this and what they're implementing related to SEL for their students. So at this point, that's just a very, very quick overview of the EdSERT program. I'd love to pull Megan back into the conversation, again, based on her experiences in the classroom in the past, how something like EdSERT could have been beneficial to her when she was in the classroom.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, this is really important to me personally because when I was teaching, I was not given the tools to really support my own personal social and emotional development. In fact, I didn't really even know about social and emotional learning until I started working at Aperture. And I remember the very first thing that I thought to myself was how different my experience would have been if I had understood that these types of skills could be learned by an adult. Really, at any point in your life, these skills can be developed and learned. And that was a huge game changer for me because even though I'm not in the classroom anymore, personally, I still focus on these skills for myself every single day. And I remember feeling the sense of hopelessness and the sense of struggle and frustration because there were certain students that I couldn't reach, certain students that had issues or problems that I couldn't help them with because I myself did not have the understanding of a specific, social or emotional skill. And one of the things that I've been really taken by specifically this year is watching some of my best friends who are still in the classroom respond to the challenges of being in a remote learning environment. 2 of my best friends work in schools with high poverty levels, and it's been so heartbreaking for me to watch them try to reach those students who may not have equitable access to the resources that they're providing through virtual learning, or to hear their stories about students on the other end of the video call who are suffering from extreme anxiety. And I just want anyone who's teaching now to know that truly when you have these skills yourself and when you have the ability to work on your own self-management and step back and take a breath, that you can then be there and be more present for your students. And it's so important to take care of yourself first. I think that notion of you can't pour from an empty cup is so true, that a lot of times we as educators forget that we have to take care of ourselves. We have to put that the mask on before we put the ear mask on someone else. So I really just think that this product and this focus on adult social and emotional learning is really invaluable, and in my mind should really be the first step when thinking about implementing SEL at a school or an after-school program.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. I appreciate you sharing your personal experiences. And I think Megan covered a lot of the bullet points that I had on this slide here in terms of what actually the research says. It's really in line with what, Megan's experiences were in the classroom, and how social and emotional learning and support for educators benefits them. I think Megan highlighted a lot of these, but research has shown that SEL for educators and having these social and emotional skills really helps them to do things like form and maintain positive relationships with students, manage their classrooms, regardless of whether those classrooms are in person or virtual, help to create a positive classroom climate that's really safe and supportive for students, and a good environment for promoting social and emotional learning. Also do things like help cope with stress, as well as just in general increasing their confidence in delivering social and emotional learning. So to wrap things up, just a quick summary of some of the things that we covered in this very brief time together today. One of the things I want to highlight is that there's growing consensus in the social and emotional learning field on the importance of supporting educators, and I highlighted, the resources from CASEL and NAA and others who are really calling for this need and this focus. There are resources needed to support pre-service and in-service training opportunities for educators and staff related to SEL. There's a need for more resources to support educators in enhancing their social and emotional competencies and well-being. I shared one of those resources today, EdSERT. There are other approaches out there and some good materials out there to support educators. And we presented EdSERT as a professional development approach that's really designed to support the knowledge, the skill set, as well as the well-being of educators. So with that, I would love to turn it back over to Emily, see if we have some time for any questions.
We do. Thank you guys so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and we actually have quite a few questions that have rolled in. So I'm going to ask a couple of them right now. The first is it possible to have access to just the assessment piece outside of the other tools for EdSERT?
That's a really good question. We have not had anyone ask that before, so I would need to think about that and get back to you. We can follow up with that person, Emily, after this webinar. I wouldn't see why not. We just have to, it's embedded within a booklet, so I'd need to think that through and how we would be able to do that. But we'll follow up.
Perfect. We'll make sure that we get with them. And I think I also want to make sure that you guys know that this is a program so that you have the assessment that's kind of more for a personal assessment. It's not one that we share or you have to share with your administration or anything like that. So it's kind of a personal reflection tool. It doesn't have to be shared with anybody else. So there's kind of that way to use it. Another question is, how can we get EdSERT?
Sure, do you want me to take that one, or Megan or Emily, do you want to?
Well, I'm happy to answer that question. So currently EdSERT is provided as a printed booklet. We do have specific pricing options based on the number of educators that you have in your building, and the pricing actually will be increasing as of August 31st. So currently, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, but currently it's $50 per educator. And with that bundle of educator booklets, which I believe is in bundles of 10, you would also receive an administrator guide. So that administrator guide kind of helps you with the implementation of the EdSERT program.
Yep, you're absolutely correct. So our pricing will increase as of September 1st. But if you ask for a quote now, and we can absolutely help you with that, your price will be good for a month. So if you have any interest in it right now, now's a great time to get a quote for that.
Right, and just to clarify, that $50 price is the introductory price that will end after August 31st.
Perfect. So this is a little bit longer of a question, so I hope you guys can bear with me. One of our questions in the chat that came up is talking about language for special education. Is there, the majority of our students have limited verbal skills and significantly challenged cognitive skills, but it does not mean that optimistic thinking and relationship skills are not equally valuable for educators and the students. Is there any special consideration given to people in the special education space, either within EdSERT, or I'm actually going to throw this also into our DESA program as well?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I can start, and then, Megan or Emily, please feel free to jump in with additional thoughts. So yeah, absolutely 100% agree with the comment in the sense that these social and emotional skills are important for all students, regardless of whether they're regular ed or special ed. And there are ways to support them, both with both the DESA and the EdSERT programs. I think the question specifically mentioned the DESA, so I will talk to that first. With the DESA, yeah, we absolutely recommend an assessment tool like the DESA be used. It can really be very beneficial, focusing on the existing social and emotional strengths of students, and supporting students in that way. I would say with the EdSERT program, we've really designed EdSERT to be applicable for teachers in all scenarios. I wouldn't say we have a lot in terms of specific accommodations for special education teachers in the EdSERT materials. I think that would be a really, really great addition and extension. I do think, though, that the practices and the strategies that we've laid out with the EdSERT resources could easily be adaptable in just thinking about them from the perspective of a special ed teacher. So I don't think we have not gone as far as laying out all of those adaptations or accommodations, but I think the practices are general enough that a special education teacher could think about it and adapt it to the specific needs of their students. But I do think that's a great thing, that a great idea for us as we continue to enhance the EdSERT materials.
I agree with you, Jen. The very first school that I taught at was a very high poverty school, and I remember that a lot of my students were labeled with, BED, behavioral emotional disorder, and that sometimes it was very difficult for me to find any sort of positive, I guess, if I should say, after meeting with certain groups of students in certain classes, and I think that the most important thing for me when I started learning more about SEL and social emotional learning was that I really needed to change my mindset, and that when I began approaching my students from their strengths, and then also being able to identify my strengths as well, it really gave me a different perspective on my classroom and the way that I was teaching my students.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you guys so much. I have a two-part question. So the first is, who is this program designed for? As in, can it be used for administration, people in the cafeteria, school bus drivers? How specific is that, the term educator?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's probably the most frequent question that we've gotten. In writing the EdSERT materials, we have really focused on teachers and staff that work directly with students. We do, sometimes use language like in your classroom, not always though. So I think, the way I've been answering this question is that it was really designed specifically for folks who interact with students. However, the practices that are included as part of the program are things that could be easily adapted and thinking about it in terms of staff. In terms of broader staff like cafeteria workers, paraprofessionals, bus drivers. So as one example of that, we have, as part of the relationship skills module, we talk about just the importance of positively greeting your students each day, and we provide suggestions for how to greet students. It might be written in the sense of a teacher, but a bus driver will greet a student in the morning. They're usually the first person, right, to greet the student in the morning. Cafeteria workers will. So the practice itself is something that's generalizable and important for all individuals, all adults in the school community, even if as part of how we've written it, we've really thought about educators first and foremost.
Wonderful. And the part 2 of that is, do you have any recommendations on how to get people who may not be as comfortable with the emotional side? And the examples given were shop teachers, auto technology, metal fabrication. How may we encourage them to get in on the SEL bandwagon?
That's a great question. And I think one way is to start by talking about how important social and emotional skills are for students, or for in careers, in the workplace and in your careers. There's a lot of good research out there that shows how important these skills are, and you can take any specific social and emotional skill and think about how it's applied for that specific profession or that content area that they're talking about or that they're teaching. I think that's one really good way to make it very concrete, and not necessarily think about the emotional side, but the concrete skills that students need to be successful in that chosen line of work.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. So we are getting a lot of actually great information, a lot of great comments about the optimistic thinking guide that we have provided previously and will be providing again in email with the slide deck and the recording for you guys. So lots of great feedback from people who already have it and are absolutely loving it, which I want to make sure, Jen, you hear, because I know how much hard work and research you put into it. So lots of great feedback there. Really excited for everybody who hasn't seen it yet to get it in their hands, to see how great all of this work is. And of course, please share it with all your colleagues too, because that's what it's here for. So I think we've hit most of our questions. So I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes back in your day. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. Thank you to Megan, and thank you to Jen for giving us all this great information. And we hope you guys really enjoyed the EdSERT program, or at least the one that we're handing out today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.